So this is a slightly enigmatic title, I'm aware. I wanted to be bold and not include a subtitle just for the sake of it. But actually, what I want to talk about is literally writing in magic. So um, this is kind of an offshoot of what I've been doing with Ugarit, where I've been trying to look at the role of writing in society and culture and how we think about kind of how people relate to writing in ways other than just the content of the text. Um, there's a long history of kind of working on magic and working on writing in magic. Often this relates to things like contacts between illiterates and literates. There's this very old kind of trope that people who don't understand writing interpret it as magical. So I put up this quote from Franz Dornsife in 1925, who talks about it being as if a ghost is speaking, that these people are astonished, and that because writing is kind of able to preserve the words of someone who isn't there, or someone who you don't know, or whatever, that this kind of leads to magical uses. He says, for the illiterate, the art of writing can be an uncanny mystery. And this is a motif you get kind of again and again in terms of thinking about contact between literate people and non-literate people. It kind of figures very prominently in accounts from kind of the early modern period, where you have sort of the conquistadores going over to the New World, and when they're trying to introduce the Bible and literacy to indigenous peoples there, they kind of very often talk in these terms of them being amazed, or else they get very annoyed because these people are not sufficiently amazed. And indeed, this is kind of carried on through a lot of 20th century anthropology as well, usually not in kind of such explicitly colonialist and kind of condescending ways, but still with this kind of undercurrent. More recently, and by recently I mean kind of the last 30 years or so, there has been a kind of reaction against this in anthropology. People have been much more aware of kind of thinking in terms of local agency, about different understandings of what writing can do, about how actually if you are encountering writing mainly as a kind of means of control, as a means of ordering your life in ways you don't want it to do, as a way of kind of imposing power upon you, then magical uses of writing, magical interpretations of writing can be extremely canny. You know, it's quite insightful to see writing as a way of affecting people and making them do things they don't want to do, if that's your main way of encountering it. So what I want to kind of talk about is how writing is used in the ancient kind of Eastern Mediterranean for magical purposes. And we can kind of divide this into two main categories, which I've sort of split into the grimoire and the amulet. So on the left here, this is not obviously ancient. This is, I think, medieval, maybe. The grimoire, kind of a spell book, a way of documenting or recording magic. So it's writing about magical practice. On the other hand, we have writing as a way of actually doing magic, kind of efficacious writing. So this is an example of a textual amulet case from the Fitzwilliam Museum. It's obviously Egyptian. I'm going to talk more about these in a minute. So just to kind of summarize, we have things like spell books, records, ritual liturgies, which document magic, and then writing, which is itself kind of magically effective. And it's very much the latter which I'm interested in here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first category of things, but mostly I'm interested in writing as a kind of supernatural, efficacious act. So I'm going to go on a bit of a whistle-stop tour here, and I'm going to start by talking about Egypt, with the proviso that I'm not a real Egyptologist. I'm not any kind of Egyptologist, and I know there are proper Egyptologists in the audience, so please do correct me where I go astray. So Egypt is in some ways kind of the clearest case study for the kind of writing magic that I've been talking about. That said, I do want to flag up that these two broad categories that I've introduced are not absolute. It's extremely easy to find things that kind of blur the line. So in Egypt, a good example of this would be the role of the lector, or sometimes called the lector priest. And they are kind of ritual practitioners whose main job is to recite texts. And on the one hand, there's a lack of clarity there as to whether the kind of magically efficacious thing is the content of the text. So does it matter if they just recite it orally, or is the act of actually reading important? And it can be quite difficult for us to get at that. So just to kind of illustrate that, these are two iconographic representations of lectors, and throughout the kind of iconography of lectors, they're usually depicted with writing materials. So the one on the left here has a rolled up scribe, so he's kind of a lector who's not in the middle of doing his job, but when they do recite, they're usually shown actually reading from an unrolled scroll. So iconographically, the act of reading seems to be important, but Egyptian iconography being what it is, that doesn't necessarily mean that they always kind of recite by reading a scroll. They may recite some things orally, and it may be a kind of iconographic convention that they're shown reading, because that's how you recognize the lector in your art. So I'm not going to talk about them in a huge amount of detail. I just wanted to flag up that there is this gray area, particularly when it comes to things like recitation. Something which can be a lot clearer is execration rites. So if you want to curse someone or something, quite often this involves an act of writing. So probably one of the most famous of these kind of rites is overthrowing Apep, the serpent. And we have a long description of the ritual that has to be carried out to ensure that Apep is defeated. And part of this, the broad magical kind of category that this falls into is what's sometimes called sympathetic magic, whereby you make a representation which you then kind of tie to the thing you want to affect. So in this case, you make a wax figure of Apep, and then you kind of bind it to the real thing by writing his name on it. This translation says in green ink. It may be fresh ink. So some people say it's kind of fresh red ink, and some people say it's green ink, because there's an ambiguity in the hieroglyphs. It's not terribly important here, except that it's nice that they do actually seem to specify the nature of the ink. You then kind of, obviously, you throw the wax representation into the fire, and when that burns, Apep is defeated. So that is a very kind of official religious example of this kind of use of writing in magical rituals. But you get the same thing in much more kind of everyday magical practice as well. This is a wax figurine of a person. It's quite late by Egyptian standards. This one is 2nd century AD, but as I understand it, you get similar kinds of things, or at least similar kinds of rituals being done pretty much throughout Egyptian history. So this one has human hair pressed in to the navel area, well, probably human hair. But then it also has a scrap of papyrus with a written part of the spell that's been pressed in as well. So you have, again, the kind of the binding, but also the use of writing as part of the magical rite. But it's not just kind of offensive magic, if you like, that is practiced in Egypt. You also get protective magic. So going back to this textual amulet, again, these seem to be quite a long-lived class of objects in Egypt, not always in this exact kind of form. So this is a metal case, which would have contained probably a rolled up piece of papyrus, which would then have incantations on it. Earlier examples may have been in just like a simple bag or something like that, or else just bound straight directly onto the body. But this idea that you could take a written text with kind of incantation or a spell on it and wear it around your body as a way of kind of having that spell constantly in effect around you seems to be kind of quite a well-established one in Egypt. On the right here, this is a New Kingdom mummy. This is not itself writing. This mummy is quite heavily tattooed. with various symbols, some of which are kind of skirting the edge of what we might call writing. Certainly they're iconographic in a sense. So here on the throat, we have numerous wedget eyes, which are a very common apotropaic symbol in Egypt. So we don't kind of directly have evidence for mummies or people being tattooed with writing, but it seems quite a plausible thing that may have happened. The other kind of way of interacting with magic that you get in terms of often in protective rituals in Egypt is directly consuming the magic. So for those of you who were at the last cruise conference, we had a very interesting paper from Cécile Guillaume-Pay, who was talking about her anthropological work in modern India. And she showed this video of people kind of writing down texts and then washing them off, and then they drink the potion that contains this kind of runoff of the text. That's a surprisingly common kind of thing to do cross-culturally. At least it was surprising to me how often I found references to this happening, including in the ancient world. So we get lots of examples of this in Egypt, as I understand it, including people kind of writing an inscription on an egg and then they lick off the ink and then they eat the egg. Or else you might soak a papyrus and then drink the kind of the ink-stained liquid. Again, very similar to what Cécile showed us in the last conference. Sorry, we also get, I think, examples of stelae that have kind of basins at the bottom, so you could run liquid down the stele over the inscribed text and then again collect up the liquid and drink it. You do also, in terms of consumption, you could also use this offensively. So I think there's an example of instructions for a spell which involve, this is a way of kind of cursing or warding off a demon, in which you would write the demon's name on a leaf, you'd wrap the leaf in meat, and then you'd feed it to a cat. So any kind of magic involving a cat is probably a good one. Okay, so that was obviously an extremely brief and superficial look at magic in Egypt. But hopefully I've at least demonstrated that writing is used in a variety of ways and was used for quite a long time. And this meshes with the kind of cosmological background that writing seems to have in Egypt, in that it was seen as a gift of the gods. So specifically, it seems it was said to have come from the god Thoth, who also carries epithets such as Lord of Hieroglyphs and Strong in Magic. And this has a kind of remarkably long-lasting kind of afterlife in terms of magical culture, with the figure of like Hermes Trismegistus, who I'm not really going to talk about today, but continues to be a significant figure right through into modern times, really. There's also this god Heka, who is illustrated here. Heka is basically the Egyptian word for magic, and he's a kind of personification or god of magic. In this depiction, he's shown carrying a tray, and again, I don't read Egyptian hieroglyphs, but I'm told these are determinatives for writing, so hopefully that is correct. On the left is a female figure. This is, well, the word is here. I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I'll make a fool of myself, but this is a kind of a female equivalent of someone's car, a kind of, again, I'm not going to try and explain the details because I don't fully understand it myself, but a figure kind of connected to Heka, but a kind of female emanation of him, something like that. Anyway, the point is that she is, again, carrying a tray, and she has a scribal kit on hers. So broadly speaking, in Egypt, we have this kind of very well integrated use of writing into magical practice, as well as a broadly kind of supernatural understanding of magic and of writing, and a kind of a long-standing understanding that that writing has a specific connection to magical practice. If we move over, sorry, there we go. If we move over to Mesopotamia, we see similarities and differences. So broadly speaking, a lot of the broad strokes of how Mesopotamian magic works are comparable to what we see in Egypt. So things like the idea of sympathetic magic, of cursing people, of wearing amulets, we see all of this in both places. When you get down to the specifics, obviously there are quite significant differences, which I don't really have time to go into today for obvious reasons. But what we do have a lot of textual sources in Mesopotamia about, sorry, that was slightly premature. We have a lot of textual sources in Mesopotamia about magical practice. A lot of these, I think, come from the Neo-Assyrian period. So this tablet that I've put up is one of the tablets of what's called the Maklu sequence, the burning, which is a Neo-Assyrian, extremely well-known series of tablets dealing with how to exercise malevolent forces that are kind of affecting you. So witchcraft, demons, things like that. Broadly speaking, a lot of this Mesopotamian material is kind of the first class of magic that I mentioned, the kind of grimoire style of they're either instructions for how to do it, or they're document of how it went, or else, or they're kind of incantations. They're not really about using writing as a magical ingredient. That said, there are certain classes of objects which clearly do involve kind of magically efficacious writing. So the most obvious of those are amulets. So this is a nice one, but it represents a kind of broader class of objects. This is a small obsidian plaque with a depiction of the demon Lamashtu, as well as then an inscribed incantation for protecting you against demonic activity. There are lots and lots of these kind of plaques involving Lamashtu, or sometimes Pazuzu, who's another kind of demon who has protective abilities. You also get just kind of clay tablets that are used as protective amulets. So these often have this kind of very characteristic protrusion. The suggestion is that they could be kind of hung around the house or something like that. Again, they kind of tend to have incantations on them, and the idea is that if you hang this up or keep it about the place, the incantation is kind of always in effect. There's also another class of objects used in, well, broadly speaking, magical practice, which is divinatory objects. So this is a clay replica liver. It's a lot earlier than a lot of the other stuff I've shown you. This is 2nd millennium BC. And again, the inscription is more kind of descriptive rather than practical. So in this case, you have a liver divided up, and then these cuneiform inscriptions tell you if you have a mark in this part of the liver, then this is how you should interpret it. So we'll come back to this idea in a minute. But broadly speaking, there is a lot of kind of description of magic in Mesopotamian writing rather than kind of direct use of actually writing in the practice. I should have said, actually, when I was talking about the Maklu. So in some ways, this is quite similar to what we see with the Apep ritual that we talked about before, in that it involves making a wax replica of the intended victim and then burning it. But whereas the Maklu, you write the name on the representation before you burn it as the kind of act of binding. In did I say the Maklu? In the Apep ritual, you write the name, whereas in the Maklu, you kind of give a verbal declaration. There's no writing involved that I could see. Anyway, what you do get is kind of metaphorical uses of writing. So going back to these divinatory replicas, we have a recurrent metaphor that crops up in these texts, or in texts about them anyway, in oracle texts, where the liver of the lamb is referred to as the tablet of the gods, and that this is somewhere where the gods kind of write down. They specifically use the word write down, and they say that Nisaba, the scribe, does it. they write down their oracular verdict. So that's kind of fun, but it's not, again, it's not actually using writing as a potentially efficacious practice. So I'm going to move now, after a grossly superficial look at Mesopotamia, to the Levant, which is my main area of expertise. And we're going to have another whistle-stop tour of magical practice here. And I do want to flag up here that I'm aware that I'm not going to be comparing like with like. We have a very patchy kind of understanding of text in the Levant, particularly in the Bronze Age. So we have good material from Ugarit, for example, in the Bronze Age. But then if we get to the Iron Age, a lot of the evidence kind of shifts to the south. So I'm going to be kind of showing you stuff from Ugarit, and then I'm going to show you stuff from Jewish magic. And I'm aware that those are not the same thing, and you can't necessarily compare them. But I think they do at least enable you to draw some broad kind of ideas about the kind of direction things are going. So broadly speaking, in Ugarit, you see a lot of things that look quite Mesopotamian. So as you would expect, given the general influence of Mesopotamian culture on Ugaritic literacy and kind of document formats, genres, things like that. So the most obvious of these are the presence of incantation texts, which we get in both Akkadian and Ugaritic and their respective writing systems. This example here is one against snakes and scorpions, but we also get them against demons. We get text referring to Lamashtu, all that kind of stuff. However, it does look like a lot of the kind of the deeper conceptual, cosmological underpinnings don't necessarily transfer across. These seem to be slightly adapted for the Levantine context. We also get divinatory livers from Ugarit. We actually get quite a lot of these, and they're often made of ivory, usually inscribed in Ugaritic. This is quite a terrible photo. It's the only one I was able to get in time. These, again, while on the surface they look like similar objects to the one we looked at before, they're a broadly similar kind of document type and broadly similar kind of divinatory practice that goes behind it. The actual texts, as I understand it, are quite different from what you get in Mesopotamia. They often, at Ugarit, don't seem to actually talk about the act of divination at all. And when they do, it's usually quite perfunctory, and generally the writing has nothing to do with the actual ritual anyway. It often kind of records the occasion that it took place. So there's a quite a well-known example which says, for so-and-so on the occasion of buying a Cypriot boy. That's all it says. So it tells you somebody consulted an oracle about this, but it doesn't, the actual act of writing isn't important in the oracular consultation. If we move down elsewhere in the Levant, it's very difficult to get at Bronze Age practice. A lot of this is people spend a lot of time trying to pick things out of biblical accounts and discuss whether or not those are actually applicable to the Bronze Age when they're set. So probably the best known one is in Numbers 5, which is kind of during the period of Moses, the Exodus. You get what's called the Sotah ritual, which again I'm probably pronouncing wrong, which is a ritual to determine whether or not a woman has been unfaithful. And part of this involves writing down particular texts, which include the name of God, and then washing water over them and then making her drink the water. So again, we can see this is another example of that kind of consumption of writing idea that we saw in Egypt and we've seen elsewhere. Whether it's come from Egypt as an idea is entirely possible, but it doesn't necessarily have to have done. The problem we have with this passage as a way of getting at Bronze Age practice in the Southern Levant should be pretty obvious, which is that the whole Exodus narrative is on extremely shaky ground, kind of historically and archaeologically speaking. and like there's no archaeological evidence to go with this particular practice at all. So whether it relates to the Bronze Age or whether it relates to a much later period is incredibly difficult to get at. If we move into the kind of the early Iron Age, then again, we can look to other parts of the Levant. We have a potential example of divinatory objects in these inscribed arrowheads that we find in Phoenicia. So these are probably the earliest objects in the Phoenician alphabet that survive. There's a fair number of them, but most of them don't have good archaeological provenances. And they're generally inscribed just with people's names. And a very long-standing interpretation of these objects is that they were used in bellomancy, so divination through the use of arrowheads. Although, as Benjamin Sass has pointed out, there's not really actually any particularly good evidence to support that. Bellomancy was practiced in the region, but for a long time that didn't involve inscriptions. So again, they may be magical in that sense, but we don't really know. We do, as we start to, in the 7th century, for example, we have continued use of amulets involving demons. So this one is from Arslan Tash in Syria and is an incantation against a creature called the sucker, or the bloodsucker. This same demon pops up at Ugarit as well, actually. I mainly included this because he's such a fun demon. He's got this big eye and he's got scorpion's feet, which is pretty cool. In the southern Levant, in the 6th century, we have textual amulets as well. So there's 2 examples from a tomb in Ketef Hinnom. I think these are the only textual amulets in the region around this time. I think they're silver. They're kind of rolled up scrolls and fairly similar to the Egyptian ones I showed earlier, but in terms of the text itself is the kind of thing you would expect. It's an incantation invoking the god and asking for protection. So as we then move forward into the kind of the later 1st millennium BCE and onwards into the current era, we start to get a bit more going on in the southern Levant in terms of actual direct use of text as kind of an efficacious thing. And a lot of this, at least initially, seems to revolve around the name of God. So this is not a great picture. I couldn't find a good picture of this, but the gold plates that the high priests wear on their heads are inscribed with the name of God, usually in Paleo-Hebrew script. And these kind of acquire, as well as the kind of the broad kind of ritual use of the object in itself, they acquire kind of secondary magical characteristics, such as a role in divination, to the extent that by the time you get to the medieval period, there are instructions on, if you're a magician and you need to get hold of one of these things, how to make a substitute if you can't get hold of a proper one. There are also other references from kind of sort of the Roman period, late antiquity, to the use of the name of God in what we might broadly call magical practice. And often these kind of retroject it back into much earlier periods. So again, going back to what I was saying earlier about the numbers 5 ritual, we have, I think these are both accounts in probably the Babylonian Talmud or some other rabbinic literature of, so there's one of Solomon who uses a ring inscribed with the name of God to bind a demon. Moses tries to magically recover Joseph's body from the Nile by using a gold piece of metal inscribed with the name of God. So I think one of the reasons I said the numbers 5 Sotar ritual was a bit doubtful for at least Bronze Age practice is because taken alongside things like this, it would probably fit a lot better into this kind of period where you have this kind of developing Jewish magical practice, and alongside an interest in kind of providing much earlier biblical precedents for these kind of activities. So, and just to kind of wrap up now, as we get well ahead of the Bronze Age into kind of the Hellenistic period, the Roman period, you start to see a lot more use of kind of play with writing, innovation in how you use writing for magical practice. And a lot of this is kind of very kind of multicultural in nature. There's a lot of kind of cross-pollination between Levantine magical practice, Jewish magical traditions, Egyptian magical traditions, Greek magical traditions, which is sort of what you would expect in the Hellenistic world, where literacy rates are much higher, where there's a lot of movement around, and obviously the Levant itself is under Hellenistic and later Roman control. So amongst these kind of things, we see the development of what are called characteres, which are a particular kind of either script or kind of additions to scripts, which are used in magical texts. So these symbols you can see that tend to have the rings on the end, which are interspersed in the general text. You also see things which are where kind of maybe a particular layout of the text is important. So we have a couple of spells which call on the practitioner to write out this Greek name Lycurgus in what's called bunch of grapes kind of orientation. So specifically like this. Okay, so I'm aware that I've gone through a lot here and I've got quite a long way from the Bronze Age, and it may not be immediately obvious what I'm trying to get at. And that's sort of deliberate, but also part of the nature of the evidence. My kind of broader conclusion, in as much as I have one, is that I hope I've shown that you can see the kind of through lines of this kind of practice around the East Mediterranean. These are clearly, there are echoes, there are commonalities, there are differences, but people are not just taking writing and automatically seeing it as magical. They're not just straightforwardly borrowing magical practice alongside other aspects of literary culture. There is a strong degree of kind of agency, of adaptation to make it fit within local cultural contexts. And this can involve things like just not really doing anything with writing in terms of magic for quite a long time, and then suddenly it takes off. So assuming that's what we have in the kind of the Jewish context, where it doesn't seem to be particularly a thing earlier on. Like, I know I've shown you with such a whistle-stop tour, it can be hard to demonstrate a negative, but it does, as I understand it, it looks like the absence of kind of earlier Jewish material in Southern Levant is probably more than just an absence of evidence. It's probably there probably is an actual lack of written material of this kind. And I can maybe go into that in the questions if necessary. But what seems to kick it off in the Southern Levant is the advent of Judaism, but the significance that gets assigned to the name of God, which then opens the door to other kinds of use of writing in magic and combines with this multicultural environment in the Hellenistic and Roman period to create really quite a large and vibrant flourishing of Jewish magical culture in the kind of first millennium AD and beyond. Whereas if we contrast that with what's going on in, say, Ugarit, where you have initially you have a kind of borrowing from Mesopotamia in much the same way as you get with a lot of other kind of writing culture, and then an adaptation of that to fit local norms, local culture, local society. So I think none of this is particularly surprising. It is what you would expect given the way culture works and given the way people tend to borrow from place to place. But I think it is quite a nice way of thinking about how writing can be more than just the symbols on the page, the literal meaning, and thinking about how people conceptualize it and integrate it into wider cultural, religious, cosmological systems. Thank you.